Thank you. Do I have slides by chance? I certainly hope I do. That'd be good. Okay, great. And please keep the slides up, if you will. And I'm going to move fairly rapidly. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak because I want to provide some perspective as a former mid-level staff officer. Just a mild correction on the biography. I'm no longer part of the United States Strategic Command. I resigned in disgust in 2011 because of politics. Next slide, please. And I want to talk about the influence of politics as it has in every part of the military establishment, even down to the lowest levels, to the people out there performing the mission. Second quote is a bit of a joke out of a famous movie. But the point is that for a long time, the nation's nuclear deterrent was kind of regarded as the crazy uncle, somebody that you kept down in the basement that nobody really talked about very much, but you just assumed that it was there, that it was healthy, and if you ever needed it, it would perform. Next slide, please. And while I was within the command, we got this tasker called the Comprehensive Joint Assessment. And it looked really big and a lot of work, so people fled from it, ran away. And I actually sat down with the tasker and started reading it and discovered that it had something to do with a chairman's risk assessment. And the folks over here will know what that's all about. And the chairman's risk assessment, that's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff telling the rest of the leadership on up in Congress, these are the risks that we think that we have to address. And out of that assessment of risk, you begin to get things like a national military strategy. You begin to get policy developed. You begin to get procurement and budgeting process. Pretty important stuff. So I took that on and impressed upon our leadership that we really had to make a great effort on this work. Next slide, please. And within the command, that's kind of a large undertaking because the command has pretty broad responsibilities. And that thing that you see up there called Global Strike, that's the crazy uncle. That's the nuclear capability combined with all the bomber capability that you can reach out on very short notice. But you see some other pretty important responsibilities up there. Like everything all that military capacity in space, all that spy reconnaissance capability, even that cyber protection capability falls under the purview of the Strategic Command because that commander has the responsibility of making tough decisions as to who's going to have what resources when things get tough. Next slide, please. First, a little bit of what strategic capability ain't. Numbers is not strategic capability. These are Iranian T-72 tanks, and in the buildup to the first Gulf War, we were really worried about these guys because they had more T-72s than any army in the world except the Russian army. And we were really concerned about them. But they couldn't do what we thought they could do. They had lots of it, but they couldn't perform. So numbers, just having toys, just having people, doesn't necessarily define what you think you can do. But for you out there, how do you assess what it is that the military can and cannot do? You have to look at a lot of different information sources that are unclassified. Next slide, please. And you get little nuggets along the way. That first quote is from an official in the Department of Energy. And that's kind of a disconcerting quote talking about the condition of an important part of his job, and that was the maintenance of our nuclear warheads. Kind of got my attention. Then the second quote made by the commander of the Strategic Command currently, just a few months ago, talked about the buildup of the Chinese military. And we've had smart people talking about that earlier today, but you really have to start defining when you have certain capabilities that you're expected to execute, you have to know what capabilities potential adversaries are going to have to execute. And what do we really know about those? That was our job in making this risk assessment. Next slide, please. And here's a good example. This is an early model Chinese anti-satellite missile tell. And we discovered back in around 2007 that they had capability to shoot down satellites in low Earth orbit. That was 2007. Today, they can take down satellites at medium and geosynchronous orbit, which means they can take down anything in outer space. And it's not that hard to do, because at low Earth orbit, we're tracking 24,000 different satellites or objects orbiting the Earth. Just one unaccounted for collision can set off a kinetic chain reaction that everything's gone within about a week. That's pretty startling. And then you combine that with the risk that we've seen earlier today. Next slide, please. And we've seen this chart earlier today. That's that EMP chart where how much reach electromagnetic impulse can have on the nation's power grid, and it's lights out Irene. Everything you have electronic that's either powered on or plugged in is toast. Next slide. Oh, that slide was supposed to be hidden. You can go on to the next slide. Yeah, that's one much more interesting anyway. These are mobile Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, we spent a lot of time during the Cold War worrying about what the Russians were doing. And the Russians have been modernizing like crazy. But the truth is that they haven't been modernizing nearly as fast as the Chinese have been modernizing. This is a 2007 version. They already have 2 follow-on systems that are much better in flight tests going on right now. In addition, they've already deployed 4 of their 5 ballistic missile submarines. So the pace with which they are developing is just absolutely mind-boggling. And the resources that they are putting into this, you can tell someone's priorities by following the money. And with the Chinese and the Russians, that's abundantly clear. Next slide, please. You combine that then with what it is that we're trying to figure out what to do with regard to our own capabilities. And again, you're confronted by certain things like age, but you also have to know what the operating parameters of these systems are. You've got to understand what it is that they have to do. And when we were trying to get that data, our own subordinate commands were reluctant sometimes to give us the ground truth. And they said, well, you can't, we can't give you that. I said, say what? My general thinks that you do. And here's my clearances, cough it up. And when we tried to pass along this data to the Joint Staff through our comprehensive joint assessment, they pushed back. They didn't want to take it. And if there's a reluctance out there to provide and receive the ground truth, that hard data, then how in the world are our political leadership and the general public supposed to be able to assess what our priorities and risks really are? Next slide, please. So, actually, I'm going to hassle the slide guy. Can you go back to, please? Okay. So, I want to point out here the ages, and this has kind of been talked about, but the 2 columns here on the left, those are the delivery systems that we currently have in our nuclear arsenal. And you can see that some of those are pretty aged. The B-52s are just about as old as I am, and that's old. But when you go over to the columns on the right, that's the age of the warheads. And look at the ages of some of those. There's not much comparable either in the Russian military, much less the Chinese military, that comes that close in terms of age. And they are rapidly upgrading their systems. Okay, if you could go ahead and advance 2 slides now. So when we were getting all this data and we were talking to all the pilots and the missile experts and the folks who flew satellites, and we were getting a good idea of just how much risk we were at. We put forth a pretty startling report to the chairman, and it worked its way up. And when we got back the report card in the form of the chairman's risk assessment, we found that all of our risk assessments had been downgraded. Everything was fine. No need to worry. And there were a series of meetings thereafter in the Pentagon with the representatives from the other combatant commands, and that was kind of like we were going to get together and discuss our differences. So I gathered up all of our classified information, and we went into the briefing room in the Pentagon, and we began to push back on the chairman's ratings. And we began to talk about in detail what some of our specific risks were, what we could not guarantee that we were able to do when it got really bad out there. As we briefed that information, jaws fell to the floor. I had a representative from the Pacific Command, literally the blood left his face. They were shocked. And as I was briefing this, the chairman's representative, who looked an awful lot like this guy up there, also a Marine, got very angry and shouted back at me, "The chairman doesn't want to hear that." Wow. So those arrows had become inverted. They weren't any longer pointing up. They were pointing down at this point. And why was that? I wasn't really surprised with the outcome at that point. I kind of had a little gleaning hint as to the fact that this was coming. Why? Next slide, please. Because this is a short time after the Nuclear Posture Review came out in 2010. And in that Nuclear Posture Review, again, Secretary of Defense estimate, everything was great. Our strategic deterrent was safe, effective, and reliable. Nothing to see here. And we began to make policies kind of suggesting that we don't even need the strategic deterrent because everybody loves each other. And that was no surprise because just a few days before this came out, the president was in Prague signing New START, that he further committed to make more strategic assets go away, that we were going to do certain things to turn down our posture and let the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians and whoever else wanted to go ahead and modernize. So literally the great and powerful Oz had decided that he was going to make the call, but don't worry, the guy who brought you, if you like your health plan, you can keep your health plan. Not to worry. And that leads me to my last slide. You can always count on the great and powerful Oz and that man behind the curtain. So I'll open it up to a few questions at this point.
Do you have any comments about Operation Jade Helm and how it's supposed to start July 15th, and also about several, like 5 Walmarts in the southern states that supposedly are able to do a lot of procurement for the military that were closed for supposedly plumbing problems?
I have to tell you up front, I haven't had access to classified since 2011. But you know, you can kind of get those telltale signs just from open press. And anytime you have special operations people preparing for a mission in the United States, that kind of raises, I've got a couple of hairs left here on the back of my neck, and they kind of stand up a little bit. Because as a lawyer, I know, no, U.S. military forces are not supposed to be operating inside the United States. We're not doing law enforcement. You don't do that. When's this start? And so I don't have any information on it, but like you, I want to know what the hell is going on.
Any other questions?
Do we have one here? Okay. You don't have to.
Oh. have two questions, actually. Should we get out of the UN? And can you bring that reconsideration up where they say it's okay?
Can we get out of the UN?
Yes.
Well, I don't think we're going to under the current administration. But should we, as someone who's practiced international law, works for me. So yeah, I think, you know, we had sufficient basis, and we were always very, very conscious whenever we took military action that we felt that we were on a firm footing. And when I was working, I had the pleasure of working for General Deptula when I was at Northern Watch, and the first question he asked me is, do we have any legal authority to be doing this? And I said, not really, except for the fact that we're still at war with Iraq. And I said, okay, yeah, I get it. So that's kind of how decisions are made at the macro level. But yeah, I'm not a big fan on the UN at all.
Consider, don't let them say it's okay.
I'm sorry?
You had said, everyone said it's okay, don't worry about the Air Force. How can you change that?
Oh, I see. Well, that's the will of the political leadership. And if you have a political leadership that wants to drive a certain result and they don't want to hear any other result, then you're not going to be able to get that done. So that's why the election cycle this next year is so important. We need another Ronald Reagan who understands those big strategic risks and is willing to make the hard decisions to get us to the place of respect and power that we once occupied.
I think recently we all became aware of that a lot of our strategic uranium was sold out to Russians. I'd just like to hear your comment on that.
Yikes, great idea, huh? And yeah, it makes you wonder how long it's going to take before that uranium winds up within Iran. But we are losing all types of critical minerals. We're losing all types of industrial capability, and we're losing brain power. I attended a conference back with Department of Energy back in 2008, and there was a real concern that we were losing our nuclear scientific capability. That we just had set that aside at the end of the Cold War and didn't think that we would ever need it again. And so I'm really concerned not only from a logistical standpoint, but also just a people and a manpower standpoint. Things are getting to the point of no return, and unless we get the political will to turn it around, it makes me very nervous.